The legacy of Colonel James Whittaker's stand at the airport stretched far beyond the immediate aftermath of the incident. What began as a single act of defiance against disrespect grew into a movement that touched countless lives, reshaping how people thought about honor, service, and equality. For Whittaker himself, the journey was transformative, not because he sought recognition, but because he understood the weight of the moment and the responsibility it carried. In the months following the controversy, accolades poured in from every direction. Congress passed resolutions honoring Whittaker for his courage and leadership, while veterans organizations presented him with awards celebrating his unwavering commitment to duty. Invitations arrived daily, from universities asking him to deliver commencement addresses to nonprofits seeking his guidance on advocacy efforts. Though Whittaker accepted some of these opportunities, he remained grounded, always redirecting the focus back to the bigger picture. "This isn't about me," he would say during speeches. "It's about remembering those who gave everything so we could live free." One of the most poignant moments came when Whittaker was invited to speak at a national memorial ceremony honoring fallen soldiers. Standing before rows of grieving families, he shared stories of bravery and sacrifice, including Sergeant Marcus Lane's. His voice cracked with emotion as he described the young man's dreams and the promise he had made to bring him home with dignity. When he finished speaking, the audience erupted in applause, not for Whittaker, but for the heroes whose memories he had honored. It was a reminder that even in loss, there is unity, and even in grief, there is hope. For Sergeant Lane's family, the impact of Whittaker's actions was profound. They had initially struggled with anger and disbelief over the treatment their son's remains had received, but witnessing the outpouring of support from strangers restored their faith in humanity. At Marcus's funeral, they thanked Whittaker personally, calling him a guardian angel sent to ensure their son's final journey was dignified. "You didn't just bring Marcus home," his mother said through tears. "You reminded us that people still care." The airline, too, underwent significant transformation. The reforms they implemented became a model for other companies navigating similar challenges. Employees reported feeling more empowered to advocate for passengers, especially those in uniform. Veterans traveling with the airline began sharing positive experiences, noting the respect and care they received. While no amount of change could erase the original mistake, the airline's willingness to grow earned them a second chance in the eyes of many. On a broader scale, Whittaker's story inspired a cultural shift. Schools incorporated lessons about his ordeal into curriculums, teaching students about perseverance, empathy, and standing up for what is right. Businesses adopted policies ensuring equitable treatment for marginalized groups, recognizing that fairness wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Even rival airlines joined forces to create industry-wide standards for handling military-related requests, proving that collaboration could overcome competition when values aligned. As time went on, Whittaker returned to his duties within the military, carrying the lessons of this experience with him. He mentored younger officers, encouraging them to lead with integrity and compassion. He also remained active in veteran advocacy, using his platform to push for systemic changes that benefited not only service members, but all individuals facing discrimination. His humility never wavered. He saw himself not as a hero, but as someone fortunate enough to be in a position to make a difference. Looking back, Whittaker often reflected on the power of collective action. What struck him most was how ordinary people, strangers united by a shared sense of justice, had turned an isolated incident into a catalyst for change. From the passengers who stood up for him at the airport to the millions who rallied online, each person played a part in driving progress. It was a testament to the idea that even in moments of darkness, humanity has the capacity to shine brightly. Colonel James Whittaker's story ended not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve. He continued serving his country with the same dedication that had defined his career, knowing that true honor comes not from titles or accolades, but from the lives we touch along the way. And though the scars of that fateful day at the airport would always remain, they served as reminders of a greater truth, that standing up for what is right even when it's hard, is how we leave the world better than we found it. In doing so, Whittaker ensured that Sergeant Marcus Lane's legacy, like his own, would endure, a beacon of hope for generations to come. Colonel James Whittaker's journey became more than just a personal mission. It evolved into a powerful symbol of resilience, justice, and unity. As the nation continued to grapple with the aftermath of the airport incident, Whittaker emerged as a figure who transcended his military role. His quiet strength and unwavering commitment to honor inspired people from all walks of life. The story of Sergeant Marcus Lane, carried forward by Whittaker's actions, sparked conversations that went far beyond one airline or one moment of discrimination. For many, Whittaker's ordeal highlighted uncomfortable truths about systemic biases in institutions across America. It wasn't just about racism. It was about how deeply ingrained prejudices could manifest in subtle yet devastating ways. People began discussing not only what had happened at the airport, but also why it had happened, and how such failures reflected broader societal issues. Schools, workplaces, and community organizations held forums where individuals shared their own experiences of being treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or profession. These dialogues weren't always easy, but they were necessary. They'd forced participants to confront uncomfortable realities and consider how they could contribute to meaningful change. Whittaker himself played a pivotal role in fostering these conversations. Though he never sought fame, he embraced the opportunity to speak out on behalf of those whose voices might otherwise go unheard. In interviews, he emphasized the importance of empathy, the ability to see the world through someone else's eyes. "We're all human beings," he often said. "When we forget that, we lose sight of what truly matters." His words resonated deeply, particularly during a time when division seemed to overshadow compassion in so many areas of life. The impact of his advocacy extended beyond rhetoric. Corporations, eager to align themselves with the values Whittaker represented, began implementing policies aimed at promoting inclusivity and respect. Airlines reviewed their procedures for handling military personnel, ensuring that similar incidents wouldn't occur again. Retailers launched campaigns celebrating service members, offering discounts and special programs for veterans. Even tech companies developed apps designed to streamline travel logistics for active-duty soldiers and their families. Each initiative, no matter how small, was a step toward creating a culture that valued service and sacrifice. Yet, amid the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone agreed with the changes sweeping through industries and communities. Critics argued that too much attention was being paid to isolated incidents, like the one involving Whittaker, dismissing them as anomalies rather than symptoms of larger problems. Some accused businesses of performative activism, making superficial adjustments without addressing deeper inequities. While these criticisms stung, they also underscored the complexity of achieving true reform. Change, Whittaker knew, was rarely straightforward. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront resistance head-on. Despite the obstacles, there were undeniable signs of hope. Families of fallen soldiers reported feeling seen and heard in ways they hadn't before. Communities rallied around memorials dedicated to local heroes, using them as opportunities to reflect on the cost of freedom. Young people, inspired by Whittaker's example, expressed renewed interest in serving their country, not just through military careers, but also through volunteer work, activism, and public service. Teachers noticed students approaching history lessons with fresh curiosity, asking questions about the sacrifices made by past generations and how they could honor those legacies today. As the months passed, Whittaker found solace in knowing that Sergeant Marcus Lane's memory had become a catalyst for positive transformation. Every policy change, every heartfelt apology, and every act of kindness inspired by this tragedy felt like a tribute to the young man who had given everything. Whittaker often thought about Lane's family, imagining the comfort they might find in knowing that their son's death had ignited a movement, a reminder that even in loss, there is purpose. Though the scars of the incident would linger, both for Whittaker and for the nation, Something beautiful had emerged from the pain. A renewed sense of shared humanity. People who had once felt invisible now believed they mattered. Institutions that had faltered were striving to do better. And a colonel who had simply tried to fulfill his duty had become a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. For Colonel James Whittaker, this was proof enough that the fight had been. The ripple effects of Colonel James Whittaker's ordeal had extended far beyond the walls of the airport, sparking a national conversation that touched every corner of society. For days, talk shows, news programs, and podcasts dissected the incident, inviting experts, veterans, and everyday citizens to weigh in on what had gone wrong and how it could be prevented in the future. The story became more than just an isolated case of poor judgment. It evolved into a mirror reflecting broader issues of respect, accountability, and systemic bias. Veterans from all branches of the military came forward with their own stories, many of which echoed Whittaker's experience. Some recounted being turned away from flights or hotels despite presenting valid identification and documentation. Others shared tales of subtle discrimination, comments about their race, dismissive attitudes toward their service, or outright hostility when they sought assistance. These accounts painted a troubling picture. While the nation celebrated its troops in parades and speeches, the reality on the ground often fell short of those lofty ideals. For many civilians, hearing these stories was a wake-up call. People who had never given much thought to the challenges faced by service members suddenly found themselves questioning their assumptions. Social media buzzed with discussions about privilege and perspective, as users urged one another to listen, learn, and take action. Schools incorporated the incident into lesson plans, teaching students about the importance of honoring sacrifices and standing up against injustice. Even businesses outside the airline industry began reevaluating their practices, asking whether they too might be guilty of overlooking the needs of marginalized groups. Politicians, eager to align themselves with public sentiment, introduced legislation aimed at protecting the rights of service members. Bills were drafted to mandate stricter penalties for companies failing to comply with military protocols, while others sought to expand benefits and resources for veterans and their families. Though some critics accused lawmakers of grandstanding, the sheer volume of proposed measures underscored the depth of the nation's collective guilt and determination to make amends. Meanwhile, Colonel Whittaker became an unexpected symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, memorial services, and community events. At each appearance, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined his actions at the airport. Rather than dwell on bitterness or anger, he focused on the lessons to be learned. "This isn't about me," he often said. "It's about ensuring that no family ever has to endure what Sergeant Marcus Lane's family went through. It's about making sure we live up to the values we claim to hold dear." His words struck a chord, particularly among younger generations. High school and college students wrote essays inspired by his courage, while social justice advocates praised him as a role model for navigating adversity with integrity. Even celebrities joined the chorus, using their platforms to amplify Whittaker's message and shine a light on the systemic changes needed to create a fairer, more inclusive society. Back at the airline, the reforms promised in the aftermath of the incident began taking shape. Employees underwent mandatory training sessions led by veterans, where they learned not only the technical aspects of handling military-related requests, but also the human side, the emotions, histories, and sacrifices tied to each uniform. Posters featuring images of service members lined the walls of break rooms, accompanied by quotes reminding staff of the honor owed to those who served. Feedback forms distributed to passengers included specific questions about interactions with military personnel, ensuring accountability remained a priority. Yet, for all the progress made, lingering doubts persisted. Some wondered if the changes were merely surface level, a temporary bandage applied to a deeper wound. Would the airline truly internalize the lessons learned, or would complacency creep back once public attention waned? Only time would tell. As weeks turned into months, Colonel Whittaker reflected on the whirlwind of events. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be battles ahead, both big and small. But he also recognized that something profound had shifted, not just within the airline or even the military, but within the hearts and minds of ordinary people. They had seen injustice and refused to look away. And in doing so, they had taken the first step toward building a world where respect and equality weren't just aspirations but realities. The fallout from the airport incident hit the airline like a tidal wave, forcing its executives into a scramble they hadn't anticipated. Within hours of the story going viral, calls and emails poured into their customer service lines, overwhelming staff who were unprepared for the sheer volume of complaints. Social media was ablaze with criticism, and hashtags like #RespectOurHeroes dominated platforms, amplifying the voices of outraged citizens demanding accountability. The airline's reputation, once polished and reliable, now teetered on the brink of collapse. In response, the company issued a public apology, a carefully worded statement expressing regret for any inconvenience caused during Colonel James Whittaker's attempt to board. But the apology fell flat. Critics pointed out that the language lacked sincerity and failed to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. To many, it felt like a hollow attempt to dodge responsibility rather than a genuine effort to make amends. Veterans groups dismissed it outright, calling it an insult to every service member who had ever worn the uniform. Facing mounting pressure, the airline launched an internal investigation. Executives brought in external consultants to review their policies, particularly those related to military protocol and handling remains. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture: inconsistent training programs, vague guidelines, and a culture that prioritized efficiency over empathy. Employees admitted that they often received little instruction on how to handle sensitive situations involving fallen soldiers or their escorts. For some frontline staff, the procedures were entirely unknown, leaving them ill-equipped to respond appropriately when faced with such scenarios. As part of their efforts to rebuild trust, the airline announced sweeping reforms. They partnered with veteran advocacy organizations to develop comprehensive training modules for all employees, emphasizing respect, dignity, and clear communication. New protocols were established to ensure that transporting fallen service members would always take precedence over other logistical concerns. Additionally, the company pledged to create advisory roles specifically for veterans within their leadership team, ensuring that military perspectives were represented at the highest levels. But actions spoke louder than words, and the airline knew gestures alone wouldn't suffice. In a bold move, they invited Colonel Whittaker to meet with their CEO personally. Initially hesitant, Whittaker agreed after consulting with his superiors, seeing an opportunity to drive meaningful change. During the meeting, he shared his experiences, not just from that day at the airport, but throughout his career, highlighting instances where systemic biases had hindered progress. His calm yet firm demeanor left a lasting impression on the CEO, who vowed to implement Whittaker's recommendations fully. Publicly, the airline also took steps to restore its image. Advertisements featuring tributes to service members began airing, showcasing real stories of heroism and sacrifice. They highlighted partnerships with charities supporting military families and promised ongoing support for initiatives aimed at honoring veterans. While skeptics remained wary, others acknowledged the airline's willingness to learn from its mistakes. For Colonel Whittaker, the aftermath of the incident served as both a burden and a catalyst. Though he never sought the spotlight, he recognized the power of his position in driving change. He used interviews and public appearances to emphasize the importance of treating all service members with respect, regardless of rank, race, or background. His message resonated deeply, inspiring conversations about equality and justice, not only in the aviation industry, but across society. Despite the turmoil, there were glimmers of hope. The junior officers accompanying Whittaker reported feeling a renewed sense of pride in their mission, bolstered by the overwhelming support they'd received from strangers around the world. Even Sergeant Marcus Lane's family expressed gratitude, saying that while nothing could ease their loss, Knowing their son's memory sparked positive change brought them a measure of comfort. By the time the dust began to settle, one truth stood undeniable. The denial of Colonel Whittaker's flight had ignited a movement. It forced individuals and institutions alike to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, privilege, and patriotism. And though the road ahead remained long, the seeds of transformation had been planted, seeds watered by courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that even in moments of injustice, humanity has the capacity to grow stronger together. The incident at the airport quickly transformed from a private struggle into a public spectacle, and Colonel James Whittaker found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. As more passengers joined the growing crowd, their outrage became palpable. Some shouted demands at the airline staff, while others recorded videos that spread like wildfire across social media platforms. The phrase "they denied a colonel's flight" while escorting a fallen soldier echoed repeatedly in posts, tweets, and live streams, capturing the attention of millions. Whittaker stood calmly amidst the chaos, his presence both commanding and composed. Despite the rising tension, he refused to let anger dictate his actions. Instead, he addressed the crowd with quiet dignity, sharing details about Sergeant Marcus Lewis, his bravery, his dreams, and the ultimate sacrifice he made for his country. His words painted a vivid picture of a young man whose life was cut tragically short, but whose legacy deserved to be honored. As Whittaker spoke, the room fell silent, save for the occasional sniffle or muffled sob from listeners overcome with emotion. One woman in the crowd, clutching her phone as she recorded the scene, tearfully recounted how her own brother had served overseas. "This isn't just about one soldier," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about all of them, the ones who come home and the ones who don't. How can we look ourselves in the mirror if we let this happen?" Her words struck a chord, resonating deeply with those around her. Others began sharing stories of loved ones who had served, creating an unspoken bond among strangers united by grief and indignation. Meanwhile, online, the story exploded. Hashtags like #RespectOurHeroes and #JusticeForSergeantLane trended nationwide within hours. Veterans organizations, military families, and everyday citizens rallied behind Whittaker, flooding the airline's social media pages with comments demanding accountability. Politicians weighed in too, condemning the treatment of a high-ranking officer and calling for investigations into the airline's policies. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with experts on military protocol and dissecting the systemic issues that allowed such an incident to occur. Back at the airport, the airline staff scrambled to contain the fallout. Executives were summoned for emergency meetings, and public relations teams worked overtime to craft responses. Yet no apology could undo the damage already done. Passengers waiting for their flights joined in solidarity, chanting slogans like "No respect, no business," and threatening to boycott the airline altogether. One family even handed over their tickets, declaring they wouldn't fly with a company that treated heroes so callously. Amidst the commotion, Whittaker remained steadfast. He declined offers from bystanders to intervene directly, knowing that maintaining professionalism was key. Still, he couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude for the support pouring in from every direction. Strangers approached him to shake his hand or offer words of encouragement. A veteran wearing a faded Marine Corps hat saluted Whittaker, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you for standing your ground, sir," he said hoarsely. "We've got your back." As the hours ticked by, other airlines took notice of the unfolding drama. Representatives from competing carriers reached out to Whittaker, offering assistance without hesitation. One major airline sent a team to the terminal, ready to arrange immediate transport for the casket and ensure the mission continued without further delay. Their swift response stood in stark contrast to the indifference Whittaker had faced earlier, highlighting the stark divide between companies that valued service and those that prioritized profit. By the time Whittaker finally boarded a different flight, accompanied by heartfelt applause from fellow passengers, the narrative had shifted entirely. What began as a routine escort mission had morphed into a national reckoning, a moment that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about respect, equality, and the sacrifices made by those in uniform. For Whittaker, the journey ahead was still fraught with challenges, but he carried with him the knowledge that he wasn't alone. Thousands of voices now echoed his call for justice, ensuring that Sergeant Marcus Lane's memory would not fade quietly into oblivion. The tension at the check-in counter reached a boiling point as Colonel James Whittaker stood face-to-face with an airline supervisor who had been summoned to address the growing conflict. By now, a small crowd had gathered around the scene, drawn by the unusual sight of a uniformed officer and a flag-draped casket being denied passage. The supervisor, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit, approached with a clipboard in hand and a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself curtly, then launched into a rehearsed explanation about operational limitations, preventing them from accommodating the casket on the flight. Whittaker listened intently, his posture rigid but controlled. His voice remained steady as he countered each excuse with logic and facts. "This is not just luggage," he said firmly, gesturing toward the casket. "This is Sergeant Marcus Lane, a soldier who gave his life for our country. There are protocols in place specifically for situations like this. Your refusal isn't just inconvenient, it's disrespectful to him, to his family, and to every person who serves." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably under Whittaker's unwavering gaze. For a brief moment, it seemed like reason might prevail. But instead of offering a solution, the supervisor doubled down, citing vague policies and claiming there was no room in the cargo hold. It was clear to everyone watching that these were empty justifications, the kind designed to deflect responsibility rather than resolve the issue. The junior officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how far they could push back without escalating the situation further. As the standoff dragged on, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some passengers began openly criticizing the airline staff, their voices rising above the hum of background noise. One man stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're telling me you can't find space for a fallen hero? What kind of operation are you running here?" Another woman chimed in, her tone sharp with indignation. "This is disgraceful. If my bags don't make it onto the plane because of this, so be it. Get that soldier where he needs to go." The growing unrest caught the attention of other travelers waiting nearby. Phones started coming out as people realized the gravity of what was unfolding before them. Someone live-streamed the confrontation, while others snapped photos and videos to share on social media. Within minutes, hashtags like #RespectOurHeroes began trending online, amplifying the outcry beyond the walls of the airport. Strangers thousands of miles away expressed outrage over the treatment of Colonel Whittaker and the blatant disregard for Sergeant Lane's sacrifice. Despite the mounting pressure, the airline staff remained unmoved. The supervisor attempted to placate Whittaker by suggesting alternative flights later in the day, but Whittaker refused to entertain delays. "We're not talking about rescheduling a vacation," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is about bringing the soldier home. Every hour counts, for his family, for his unit, for everyone who cares about honoring his memory. You have a duty to fulfill, and I won't leave until you do." For the first time since the ordeal began, cracks appeared in the supervisor's polished demeanor. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he glanced nervously at the growing audience. He tried to retreat behind policy manuals and procedural jargon, but Whittaker wasn't having it. With quiet authority, he addressed the crowd directly, sharing the story of Sergeant Marcus Lane, his dreams, his bravery, and the ultimate price he paid. As Whittaker spoke, the room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Tears welled up in some eyes, while others clenched their fists in anger. It was impossible to ignore the symbolism of the moment. A black colonel standing tall against systemic indifference, fighting not only for himself, but for all those who had ever been dismissed or overlooked. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a man who had devoted his life to protecting freedoms that many took for granted, yet he was being treated as if his mission, and the life it honored, didn't matter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor relented, promising to escalate the matter to higher authorities within the airline. But the damage was done. The delay had already stretched too long, and trust between Whitaker and the airline was shattered. As the crowd dispersed, muttering angrily about corporate negligence, Whitaker turned his focus back to the task at hand. He knew the fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. And though the odds seemed stacked against him, one thing was certain: Colonel James Whitaker would stop at nothing to ensure Sergeant Marcus Lane's final journey ended with the honor it deserved. The morning of the flight was crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the heavy burden Colonel James Whitaker carried in his heart. As he arrived at the airport with 2 junior officers, the flag-draped casket holding Sergeant Marcus Lane's remains was carefully loaded onto a cart. The sight of it sent a wave of quiet reverence through everyone nearby, except, it seemed, for the airline staff. Whitaker took a deep breath, reminding himself that this mission wasn't about him. It was about ensuring Lane received the honor he deserved. Whitaker had spent years leading soldiers, making tough decisions under pressure, and navigating challenges that would break most people. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. When he approached the check-in counter, dressed in his immaculate uniform, he expected professionalism and respect. Instead, he encountered confusion and then resistance. The agent behind the desk glanced nervously at the casket before informing Whitaker that they couldn't accommodate it on the flight. Her tone was apologetic, but her words were dismissive. At first, Whitaker thought it was a simple misunderstanding. He calmly explained the situation, presenting official documentation that outlined the procedures for transporting fallen service members. The paperwork was clear. Airlines were required to prioritize such missions. Yet the agent hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if seeking guidance from someone else. That's when Whitaker noticed the subtle shift in behavior, the way she avoided eye contact, the awkward shuffle of feet, the murmured excuses about logistical issues. It wasn't just bureaucracy standing in their way. It felt personal. As minutes ticked by, frustration began to simmer beneath Whitaker's composed exterior. He glanced at the 2 junior officers accompanying him, both visibly uneasy. They exchanged worried looks, unsure of how to proceed. Whitaker knew that losing his temper wouldn't help, but the injustice of the situation gnawed at him. Here he was, a decorated colonel tasked with one of the most sacred duties in the military, being treated like an inconvenience. It wasn't just disrespectful to him. It was a dishonor to Sergeant Lane and everything he had given up for his country. What made the moment even more painful was the weight of Lane's story pressing down on Whitaker. He couldn't stop thinking about the young man inside that casket, the laughter that once filled barracks, the letters written home, the dreams cut tragically short. Whitaker imagined Lane's family waiting anxiously for closure, unaware that their son's final journey was being delayed by indifference. Every second wasted at the counter felt like another blow to the dignity of a hero who had already sacrificed everything. Passengers began to take notice. A few stopped scrolling through their phones or chatting with companions to observe the unfolding scene. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply stared, trying to understand why a man in uniform was being turned away. One elderly woman walked closer, her eyes fixed on the casket draped in the American flag. She placed a hand over her heart and bowed her head briefly, a silent gesture of respect. Whitaker caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone here understood the gravity of the moment. But the standoff continued. Despite Whitaker's repeated attempts to clarify the situation, the airline staff remained firm in their refusal. Each new excuse felt like a brick added to an invisible wall separating Whitaker from completing his mission. The longer the delay stretched, the heavier the atmosphere became. Even the junior officers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension radiating off their commanding officer. Whitaker clenched his jaw, determined not to let anger cloud his judgment. This wasn't just about getting on a plane. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult the fight might be. Unbeknownst to Whittaker, the events of this day were about to ripple far beyond the confines of the airport. What started as a private struggle against bureaucratic red tape would soon explode into a national conversation about respect, accountability, and the true meaning of patriotism. For now, though, Whittaker stood tall, refusing to back down. His resolve hardened with each passing minute, fueled by the memory of Sergeant Marcus Lane and the promise he had made to bring him home with honor. Colonel James Whittaker was not just another name in the military. He was a man whose life spoke of courage, discipline, and an unshakable sense of duty. Born into a modest family in a small town, Whittaker grew up listening to stories about his grandfather, who had served in World War I. Those tales planted a seed in young James's heart, a desire to serve his country and make a difference. From the moment he joined the military, Whittaker dedicated himself fully to the cause. He climbed the ranks through sheer hard work, earning respect from peers and superiors alike. What set Whittaker apart wasn't just his accomplishments or medals, it was the way he carried himself. Standing tall at 6 feet 2 inches, with a calm demeanor and piercing eyes, he commanded attention without ever raising his voice. His soldiers admired him because he led by example, whether it was enduring grueling training sessions alongside recruits or staying up late to ensure everyone had what they needed for a mission. Whittaker always put others first. For him, leadership wasn't about authority, it was about service. But there was something deeper that drove Colonel Whittaker: his belief in honoring every single person who wore the uniform. To him, no sacrifice was too small to be remembered, no life insignificant. This philosophy became even more profound when he lost close friends in combat. Each loss left a mark on his soul, reminding him of the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the stars on his shoulders. When the call came for him to escort the remains of Sergeant Marcus Lane back home, Whittaker felt a mix of emotions: pride, sorrow, and determination. Escorting a fallen soldier was one of the most sacred duties in the military, and Whittaker approached it with the reverence it deserved. He knew this wasn't just about bringing a body home. It was about returning a son, a brother, a friend to the people who loved him. It was about closure, for the family, for the comrades left behind, and for the nation that owed its peace to brave men like Lane. As Whittaker prepared for the journey, he thought about Sergeant Lane's story. Lane had been a bright young man, full of dreams and energy. He joined the military to protect his country and give back to his community. Whittaker remembered the letters Lane used to write home, sharing his hopes of becoming a teacher once his service ended. Those letters now seemed hauntingly unfinished, a reminder of promises broken too soon. Whittaker vowed to carry Lane's memory with dignity, ensuring that his final trip home would reflect the honor he had earned. The day before the flight, Whittaker meticulously planned every detail. He checked the paperwork multiple times, ensuring nothing would go wrong. He polished his uniform until it gleamed under the light, knowing that how he presented himself mattered. This wasn't just about appearances. It was about showing respect. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his hat one last time, Whittaker whispered a silent promise to Sergeant Lane: "I'll get you home, son, no matter what." Little did Whittaker know, the journey ahead would test not only his patience, but also his faith in humanity. What should have been a straightforward mission would soon turn into a battle of its own, a fight against prejudice, ignorance, and systemic failure. But if there was one thing Colonel James Whittaker was known for, it was his ability to rise above challenges. And as fate would have it, this chapter in his life would become one of the most defining moments, not just for him, but for countless others watching from afar.